Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where America's forgotten past comes alive. Before we begin today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss the hidden chapters of our history. Now, let us step back into the shadows of old America. The story of America is a story of families. Families bound by blood, by faith, by land, and sometimes by strange habits that became tradition. There are lines of men and women who carried honor through generations, passing on strong shoulders, sharp eyes, and steady hands. But there are also families whose stories slipped sideways, or customs twisted into curses, and the passing of years only made the burden heavier. Among the darker corners of early American history, whispered in old letters and remembered in fragments of folklore, lies the tale of a bloodline that bound itself not just to the land or the people around them, but to the animals they shared their lives with. For 8 generations, a family lived side by side, even bed by bed, with their dogs. And in the end, what began as loyalty and warmth grew into something monstrous. It began in the early 1700s, when the first settlers of this line came to the backwoods of Virginia. They were poor, worn down by the crossing of the Atlantic, carrying little more than a trunk, a Bible, and a hound that had been their companion since England. The hound, a shaggy black cur, had guarded the children on the ship and slept beside them through storms. When they landed, the family built a cabin from rough logs, a single room with dirt floors, and the hound lay on the bed of straw right against the father's side. In those days, no one thought much of it. Dogs were part of survival. They guarded against wolves, sniffed out game, and gave warmth in cabins where the wind cut through every crack in the wall. But over time, what was necessity hardened into something else. That first generation spoke of the dog as if it were kin. They carved its likeness into the family chest, and when it died, they buried it in the small patch of land where the grandparents lay. It might have been the end of it, just an odd devotion to a faithful creature. But children watch what their parents do. The son of that house took on the same habit. Every night he led his dogs onto his bed of rough linen, their paws scratching the wool, their breath mixing with his. His children grew up with the same sense that a bed without a dog beside you was not complete, that warmth and safety were not found in a spouse's arms, but in the press of a muzzle against your back. By the time the second and third generations settled further into the valleys of Kentucky, the practice was not spoken of as a choice. It was a rule. Marriages were formed in cabins where every night the dogs climbed up, pushing their weight against husband and wife alike. Babies learned to crawl across the floor toward the wagging tails, and more than once the infant was placed in the straw crib with a dog curled at its feet to keep the child warm. To neighbors, it was peculiar, but frontier life was strange in many ways. Families lived in isolation, miles apart, and if one clan had their oddities, it was rarely questioned. But as years wore on, the dogs of this family were no longer just working hounds. They were bred close, kept inside, treated not as beasts, but as heirs of the home. They slept under quilts, their fur shedding into every thread. They ate from the table scraps, sometimes even fed mouth to mouth by children who thought nothing of it. When the father fell sick, it was said his dog licked his face through fevered nights, and when the father passed, the widow swore the beast howled like a son at the grave. These stories, told in soft voices around firelight, became part of the family's myth. A dog was no animal. It was blood. By the 4th generation, something darker began to show. There were whispers of children born pale and weak, with odd jaws and sunken eyes, whose growth was slow and whose speech came late. Neighbors muttered that the bloodline was touched, that marrying cousins and keeping so close to animals had done something to the seed. One creature, passing through the valley, warned the family that the Lord had set man apart from beasts for a reason. He thundered that to blur the line was sign. But they laughed him out of the cabin. A man's only true friend is his dog, the eldest said, and the others nodded in agreement. Still, the preacher's words haunted a few. Some daughters married out, seeking life in towns where the dogs stayed in barns. But the sons who stayed behind carried on the tradition. Night after night, the dogs slept in their beds, licking the children's faces, sharing breath, sharing sickness. And sickness did come. There were fevers that swept through, strange sores that grew on the skin, coughs that rattled the lungs for months. Doctors were scarce, but those who visited shook their heads and spoke of contagion, of filth carried from animal to man. Yet the family would not listen. They buried their children beside their dogs, sometimes in the same grave. Through the long years of war and hardship, from the Revolution to the Civil War, the bloodline persisted. Some fought in gray, others in blue, but wherever they marched, their dogs followed. Soldiers in nearby camps recalled the sight of these men sleeping not with comrades, but with dogs curled on their coats. One officer wrote in his diary that the men seemed more beast than man, their loyalty not to flag nor country, but to the curs they clutched at night. Such words might have been cruel, but they carried an uneasy truth. By the 6th generation, in the hills of Appalachia, the family had become a legend of sorts. Neighbors spoke of their strange eyes, their heavy jaws, their tendency to mutter and snarl more than laugh. They were feared more than loved, not for violence, but for their difference. Children whispered that they could hear the family howling at night with their dogs, that they shared some language not meant for human tongues. When outsiders married in, they found themselves pulled into the same pattern. A bed always crowded, the smell of dog fur thick in the quilts, the sense that they had joined not a family, but a pack. What made it monstrous was not one act, not one decision, but the slow weight of years. 8 generations of sleeping side by side with dogs, breathing the same air, sharing the same sicknesses, shaping children to believe man and beast were one. Over time, the line blurred so deeply that neighbors began to wonder if they were looking at men at all, or some half-formed breed made from too much closeness. They were not violent monsters, not killers in the night, but something more unsettling. A family whose very blood seemed shaped by the habit of 1,000 nights pressed against the warmth of fur instead of the warmth of man. And though many would call it myth, there were records enough, old census notes, birth registries, letters written in shaky hands to show the family was real. They lived, they married, they bore children, and across the years their name carried a shadow. The dogs lived as long as the men, and sometimes longer. Some swore that when one of the bloodline died, his dog refused food until it too perished. Graves grew thick with markers for both man and beast, side by side, until the cemetery looked more like a kennel of the dead than a churchyard. As the decades rolled into the 20th century, the line had already begun to fade. Some branches scattered into cities, leaving the dogs behind. But in the hollows and hills, there remained a few who clung to the old way. And it was in their faces, their sloping shoulders, their odd pale eyes, that the old curse showed itself most clearly. They were not beasts, not demons, but neither were they like the neighbors in town. They carried something in them, something bred by centuries of nights, where the line between man and dog was erased, where warmth turned into dependence, and dependence turned into inheritance. And so the tale was passed down, 8 generations in bed with dogs, 8 generations of blurred lines and broken flesh, 8 generations that gave rise to a bloodline, not remembered for honor or courage, but for the monstrous shadow that clung to their name. The old hills have a way of keeping secrets. They hold stories in the bark of the trees, in the creak of the cabins that lean against the wind, in the graveyards where moss eats away at names. And in those Appalachian valleys where the family rooted itself, The story of their closeness to dogs passed on like a hushed prayer. By the late 1800s, it was not just an odd tale. It was something that shaped how neighbors looked at them, how children whispered about them, how marriages were decided and land was sold. The family had grown large by then, branches spreading across hollows and ridges. They built cabins deeper in the woods, away from main roads, where they lived by hunting, small farming, and barter. And in every one of those cabins, the beds were crowded. A man, his wife, 3 or 4 children, and 2 or 3 dogs would all curl together beneath patched quilts, pressed shoulder to shoulder. The smell of sweat, smoke, and fur mixed into a heaviness that clung to the air. For them, it was comfort. For outsiders, it was unbearable. By the 6th and 7th generations, their faces bore the mark of the old habit. Travelers passing through wrote notes in diaries that have survived in faded ink. One described meeting a boy of 12 who seemed half-formed, with pale eyes too large for his face, who spoke little but clung to a hound as if it were his mother. Another told of a woman who walked into a trading post with 2 dogs at her side, one pressed so close against her that it seemed hard to tell where her coat ended and its fur began. She never raised her eyes, the note read, but when she left, the smell of her dogs lingered like a shadow. It is easy, in our time, to call such stories exaggeration. People have always mocked those who live different. But letters and reports pile one upon another, not all cruel, some even tender. A doctor who traveled the hills to give medicine in the 1890s wrote of a family child who died in fever. He arrived too late, but what struck him most was not the sickness, but the way the dogs surrounded the child's body, refusing to move. They howled when I drew near, and the father wept not as a father, but as one of the pack. He pressed his face into the dog's neck, and it was hard to tell who he mourned more, the boy or the beast. And here was the truth of it. They did not see a difference. The line between kin and animal was erased. They gave dogs names that were passed down like family names: Jeb, Amos, Ruth, even Mary. Sometimes the same name was given again and again, as if the dog were reborn each time. When a son died, another dog would be given his name, and the mother would cradle it with the same tenderness. Outsiders called it madness. The family called it memory. Yet madness was not far behind. By the early 20th century, sickness stalked the line. Strange afflictions ran in the blood, jaws too long, teeth twisted, children who walked late, some who never spoke more than a few broken words. Neighbors said they saw the children crawling on all fours, growling when startled. Whether truth or rumor, the image burned into local legend. Parents in nearby towns warned their children, "Don't wander too close to that hollow. The dog people will catch you." Isolation made it worse. While the world around them moved forward, trains whistling through valleys, coal camps rising, new schools opening, the family stayed back in the old ways. They worked small fields, hunted squirrels and deer, and spent their evenings by firelight with the dogs curled around them. A teacher who once tried to bring the children into a one-room schoolhouse wrote that she lasted only a month. "They came with fleas," she wrote, "and their smell filled the room." They clung to each other, silent, their eyes darting like cornered animals. And when one cried, it was the dogs outside that howled in answer. Still, not every part of the story is horror. Some tell of their loyalty, their strange kind of tenderness. A neighbor who fell sick with influenza in 1918 remembered the family bringing him meat and firewood when no one else dared visit. "They came barefoot, with dogs at their heels," he said, "and though they smelled of hounds, they saved me." Perhaps it was that closeness to animals that gave them endurance, some immunity to loneliness, to hunger, to the hard winters that broke other men. Where one man leaned on a church or a town, they leaned on their pack. But there was a price. By the seventh and eighth generations, their bodies showed what their choices had done. Broad faces with low brows, eyes pale and unfocused, shoulders slumped, voices rough like growls. Doctors whispered about inbreeding, about blood thinned too close upon itself. Others blamed the constant presence of animals, the sicknesses shared across species. Whatever the cause, the result was a line that no longer looked or moved like neighbors in town. The monstrous name clung to them not because they were cruel, but because they seemed shaped by something not wholly human. And so the legend spread. Folks traveling through Appalachia would hear it told by firelight, the tale of the dog-blood family. Sometimes the story was told as a warning to children, sometimes as a curiosity for travelers, sometimes as a cruel joke. But in every telling, the truth was bent a little further, until some swore they had tails, or that they could run on all fours faster than any man. Most of that was nonsense. They were flesh and blood, no different at birth from any other. But the habit of centuries, the closeness carried through generations, left its mark so deeply that the eye saw difference. And once the eye sees difference, the mind makes monsters. Yet the heart of the story remains painfully human. These were not demons, but people clinging to what gave them comfort. In cabins where winters bit hard, a dog's warmth was life itself. In days when children died young, a dog's loyalty was a balm no preacher's sermon could match. And in the loneliness of the hills, where neighbors were miles away and grief was constant, the sound of a dog's breath beside you at night was the sound of survival. Still, the curse of survival is that it does not always make you stronger. Sometimes it twists you, bends you into shapes you never meant to take. And so, by the time the eighth generation was born, the family carried a shadow that could not be shaken. They had become a story more than a people. The dog-bloods, the bed-sharers, the monstrous line that blurred the boundary between man and beast. The world was changing. Around them, automobiles rattled down dirt roads. Radios sang from town porches. Young men were drafted for wars overseas. But in those deep hollows, the family still lay down each night with their dogs pressed close, still raised their children with fur in the quilts and paws on the pillow. And though the outside world saw only strangeness, within those cabins it was simply life. It was comfort. It was family. But time does not let old ways rest forever. As the 20th century moved on, the pressure of change began to crack even the oldest traditions. Children who managed to leave the hills carried shame with them, desperate to bury the stories of their upbringing. Some changed their names, married into towns, and never spoke of the dogs that had once slept in their cribs. Others stayed behind, clinging to the old warmth even as the world called them monstrous. And so the line stood at a crossroads, torn between memory and survival. For 8 generations, they had built their lives in beds filled with fur and breath, shaping themselves in ways the world could not understand. Now, standing in the light of a new century, the question was whether the bloodline would finally break free of the shadow or sink deeper into it. The first half of the 20th century was not kind to those who clung to the old ways. America was moving fast. Trains cut deeper into the valleys. Coal companies set up camps. Schools reached further into the backwoods, and radio carried voices from cities into the smallest cabins. Change thundered in like a storm, and most families, whether they liked it or not, went with the wind. But this family, the one that for 8 generations had shared their beds with dogs, held their ground in their cabins. The nights looked the same as they had a century before. The dogs still climbed up onto straw mattresses or patchwork quilts. Children still reached for fur before they reached for their mother's hand. And men, tired from hunting or farm work, still fell asleep with the weight of a hound against their chest. To them, nothing had changed. But outside those cabins, the world had. Neighbors began to talk more openly, less with whispers and more with open scorn. They stink of dogs, people said at stores. They're not right in the head. Children from the bloodline who tried to attend school faced taunts that cut deep. Other children pinched their noses when they walked in, called them dog breath, mutts, or worse. Teachers, weary of fleas and the constant distraction of scratching and fidgeting, sometimes asked them not to return. Some families left school altogether, pulling their children back into the woods, where the only friends they had were the animals they had always known. The shame grew heavy. One boy, remembered in a teacher's journal from the 1930s, sat silent for weeks, never speaking more than a word or two. The teacher tried to coax him, but it was only when his hound scratched at the schoolhouse door one afternoon that the boy's face lit with joy. He ran outside, threw his arms around the animal, and the two rolled together in the dirt. The other children laughed, but the teacher, watching, wrote, "He only smiled when he was with the dog." With us, he was a shadow. This was the curse that lingered on them. Not claws, not fangs, but separation. They had bound themselves so close to dogs that other men could not see them as equals anymore. They were apart, not by choice perhaps, but by habit, and habit is the strongest chain of all. The Great Depression made the divide worse. Hunger drove many to towns in search of work, but the family stayed back, clinging to what the land could give. They ate little, shared everything, and leaned on their dogs not just for warmth, but for food. Old men in the hills told stories of hunting dogs, bringing down rabbits, squirrels, even deer when no gunpowder could be spared. Mothers boiled bones for broth, letting the dogs gnaw the scraps. Survival was not man or beast alone. It was both together. Yet every year of closeness deepened the mark upon the bloodline dot by the 1940s. When war once again swept the world, young men from the bloodline were called to serve. Some went willingly, some were drafted, but all carried the same mark. In barracks, their habits showed quickly. They whistled to stray dogs, slept with them in bunks when no one was looking. Fellow soldiers wrote home about those mountain boys who couldn't be kept from the curse. Some fought well, some died far from home, and when their names were written on stones in government cemeteries, no one carved the dogs that might have stood watch over their graves. But back home, the families mourned with the same rituals they always had. A son lost in war was remembered not just in prayers, but in the naming of the next pup born in the cabin dot. It was during these decades that the legend of the bloodline reached its peak. Writers, folklorists, and traveling preachers all seized upon it. Some described them as beasts, half man and half dog. Others used them as a cautionary tale about sin, warning that God punishes those who blur the lines he set. Some few told their story with pity, painting them as broken souls trapped in the past. And always the word monstrous hung in the telling. Not because they killed, not because they terrorized, but because they were different. Yet inside the cabins, the people did not call themselves monstrous. They called themselves family. They laughed around firelight, sang hymns with dogs howling alongside, and found joy where they could. They did not think of themselves as twisted or cursed. They thought of themselves as what they had always been, men and women who found their closest kin in their animals. But even within, cracks began to form. Children who reached adolescence often felt the pull of two worlds. Some longed for towns, for schools, for a chance to marry outside and escape the whispers. Others clung fiercely to the dogs and the old way, refusing to step foot in a town where they were mocked. Brothers and sisters quarreled, some leaving, some staying, the line splitting slowly with each new generation. Those who left often changed their names, cut ties, and never looked back. They spoke little of their childhood, sometimes never at all. They carried the shame like a stone in their pocket, always there, never shown. The ones who stayed behind became fewer, but more set in their ways. Outsiders who stumbled across their cabins in the 1950s described eerie scenes. A dim room with no chairs, only a bed piled high, men and women and children all sitting or lying with dogs pressed against them. The smell, they said, was thick enough to choke. Yet when the family smiled, their smiles were wide, genuine, as if they lived in joy rather than squalor. It was this contradiction that unsettled visitors most. They seemed happy in what others saw as monstrous. And perhaps that is what makes the story hardest for us now. We want to believe monsters are evil, cruel, bloodthirsty. But this family was not. They were kind in their own way, generous to neighbors when they could be, loyal to one another with a ferocity that shamed other men. Their monstrousness lay not in deeds, but in difference, in the way they looked, the way they smelled, the way they lived with animals, as if no boundary had ever existed. By the late 20th century, only a handful of the old bloodline remained in the deep hollows. Roads reached further, schools pushed harder, and shame drove many to abandon the tradition. Yet even then, in scattered cabins, the habit continued. Old women lay down at night with 3 or 4 hounds curled tight against them. Old men fed dogs at their tables as if they were sons. And in the eyes of the children born into those cabins, the mark still lingered, pale, watery, unfocused, as if carrying centuries of shared breath and shared sickness. And so the bloodline lingered on, half remembered in folklore, half hidden in the hills. Some say it has died out now, swallowed by time, forgotten as the last cabins rotted into the earth. Others whisper that in some valley, cut off from roads and phones, the old habit still lives, that there are still beds crowded with dogs and children who know no difference between kin and beast. Whether true or not, the tale carries the same weight it always has. A warning about how tradition can twist, how love can blur, how survival can shape a family into something the world no longer recognizes. It was not cruelty that made them monstrous. It was love carried too far, a love that forgot the lines that keep man and beast apart. And when love crosses that line, it changes not just a night, not just a life, but a bloodline. By the end of the 8th generation, the family was no longer just a family. They were a legend, a shadow that clung to American history, a reminder of how even the smallest customs can ripple across centuries and leave marks deeper than anyone first imagined. The story of the bloodline is not one that ends cleanly. It does not close with a single grave, nor does it vanish in one generation's choice to walk away. It lingers, as all deep traditions do, in whispers, in memories, in the faces of children who grow up and never quite escape what their parents gave them. By the 1960s and 70s, the hills of Appalachia had been carved by highways and strip mines. The roar of machines cut through valleys where once only hounds had howled. The old cabins, smoky and leaning, stood like bones against the progress around them. Many of the family's descendants had scattered by then. Some moved to cities, some married into other lines, some carried on their lives as ordinary men and women, hiding their past like a scar beneath their clothing. They worked in factories, sat in pews, sent their children to schools, and did their best to bury the memory of dogs sleeping under quilts. But memory is not so easily buried. Those who had grown up in the old cabins could never quite shake the feeling of needing a hound close by. They adopted strays, filled porches with barking companions, and even in city apartments, they made room for dogs on beds where spouses grew resentful. A few spoke of it openly, but most did not. Shame clung to them. They feared laughter, feared the word that had been used for generations, monstrous. Meanwhile, in the hills, the last of the old bloodline kept to themselves. By then, the family had dwindled to a few scattered households, stubborn against the tide of modernity. Reporters and folklorists who tracked them down in the 1970s described scenes almost identical to those written 100 years earlier. Dark cabins, crowded beds, pale children clinging to hounds. The names of the dogs were still passed down like heirlooms, still carved into the same rough gravestones. Even when electricity and radios reached their hollows, the family held to the ritual as if nothing else in the world mattered. Neighbors called them the pack, not with affection, not with kindness, but with unease. The children who tried to join schools often dropped out within months, driven away by ridicule. Others never tried at all. By this time, America had little patience left for old strangeness. Television showed shining cities, clean houses, polished smiles. There was no room in that vision for families who still lay down each night in beds thick with fur and fleas. And so the old bloodline became more legend than reality, spoken of less as kin and more as a cautionary tale. But legends carry power. By the 1980s, the story of the dog-blood family was being retold in books of Appalachian folklore, in late-night radio shows, and even in horror magazines. Writers twisted the truth, adding details that never were. Children born with tails, men who howled at the moon, women who suckled pups as if they were infants. The reality was simpler, sadder, and in its own way, more haunting. They were people who loved too deeply, who blurred lines too long, until their faces and habits bore the cost. Yet the world rarely tells simple truths. The monstrous story was more entertaining than the human one, and so the legend grew. Still, the true remnants of the bloodline lived quietly, stubbornly, in their hollows. Some of the last were interviewed by anthropologists who walked the hills in the 1990s. One old woman, her back bent, her eyes pale as glass, spoke softly of her childhood. "We had dogs in the bed every night," she said. "Didn't know any other way. My daddy said the Lord gave us dogs to keep us warm, and my mama said a dog was the only soul that never left you." When asked if she thought it strange, she shook her head. No stranger than neighbors singing to the Lord. We sang with the dogs. Her words cut through the monstrous stories and showed the truth at its heart. To them, the habit was never sin or sickness. It was faith in its own way. Faith in loyalty, in warmth, in companionship that never betrayed. If it twisted their line, if it marked their children, they bore it not as shame, but as part of life. Yet the outside world was not forgiving. The last generations faced ridicule, poverty, and a weight of shame heavier than the quilt of fur they slept under. Some gave up the tradition out of sheer survival, separating dogs from beds, teaching children to lie about how they had been raised. Others clung to it until the end, dying in cabins where dogs curled at their feet. By the dawn of the 21st century, most agreed that the line had vanished. The cabins rotted, the graves grew over with weeds, and the last names of the family faded from census rolls. But stories are not so easily erased. Children still whisper in Appalachian towns that if you walk the ridges at night, you can hear the howling of dogs mingled with human voices. Hunters tell of seeing pale-eyed figures moving through the trees, silent until a hound's bark splits the night. And old-timers, rocking on porches, shake their heads and mutter that some bloodlines never really die. The truth, perhaps, is that the family became both legend and warning. A warning about what happens when traditions are followed too blindly. A warning about the danger of blurring lines meant to keep order. But also, in a quieter sense, a warning about love itself, about how love, even the purest kind, can twist when carried too far. They did not mean to make themselves monstrous. They only meant to keep warm, to keep close, to keep the one companion who never betrayed them. And maybe that is why the story still grips us. Because in the shadow of the monstrous, we see something of ourselves. Who among us has not leaned too hard on comfort, carried habits that turned to chains, loved something so deeply it left a mark? The family of the dogs only made visible what we all carry in smaller, quieter ways. 8 generations of beds shared, 8 generations of warmth and breath and loyalty. 8 generations that gave the world a bloodline, whispered of as monstrous. And in the end, perhaps the greatest tragedy was not in what they became, but in how the world chose to see them. For behind the legend of beasts and shadows lay the simple truth. They were only people, clinging to love in a world that gave them little else. The hills keep their secrets, but they also keep their ghosts. And if you find yourself walking some forgotten hollow where the cabins have fallen and the graves lie unmarked, you may feel the eyes of something watching from the trees. Perhaps it is only a hound loyal as ever, waiting for the master who never returned. Or perhaps it is the shadow of a bloodline that lived and died in the space between man and beast, remembered now only as the monstrous family that slept too long with their dogs. But if you pause, if you listen closely, the sound you hear may not be monstrous at all. It may be the soft, steady breath of a dog curled against a human chest, the same sound that carried 8 generations through hunger, sickness, war, and sorrow. And in that sound, perhaps, lies not horror, but the most human truth of all, that love, even when twisted, even when cursed, is still love. And that is how a family, across 8 generations, became both a warning and a legend. Not because they were beasts, not because they were demons, but because they were human, human in ways that frightened the world, human in ways that blurred the line, human in ways that will never be forgotten.